So I thought a good place to start, I've kind of organized this work in a way that's removed it from the projects in which I've categorized them. And I've really kind of tried to find a narration for over the past year and presented these largely in chronological order. And I decided to even go back before 2020 because I think, as I had mentioned in the feature that I wrote for 6 Feet, that for me to contemplate this time that I'm living in right now, I have to think about everything that came before. So in 2016, I personally became diagnosed with chronic illness, and that was around the time that I started approaching my family to document them and their struggle with chronic illness. So in a way, I'm almost beginning to photograph myself through them and approaching my own struggles through what they chose to share with me. So this body of work, called A Family of Complicated Bodies, um, we came together as a family and talked about it before I had even begun shooting, because it was really important to me that I wasn't exploiting my family or didn't feel like I was abusing the access that I have. Access is a word that kind of gets thrown around a lot in photography without really understanding what access is. Um, I feel so privileged and grateful that my family has offered up our private lives in order to have these discussions about chronic illness and things that they experience. And I think in making this work too, I really wanted to touch on not only how we experience chronic illness, but how others experience, or others, I'm looking for a certain word here, how others perceive people with chronic illness. And so kind of talking about my responsibility to the community that I exist within, the disabled community and chronically ill community, I wanted to kind of touch on how do we start making conversations with people who don't experience illness, and how can we start doing that in a way where there's a human connection there rather than just how making a sensationalized image. I really wanted to focus more on very intimate moments that showed that my family who experiences illness, they're human and they have lives just like everybody else, although they're altered lives. And again, going back to the private versus public eye, this is one of the few images where I really focus in on the medication aspect of chronic illness. And I do that for a pretty specific reason, because I think a lot of times when we talk about things like chronic illness, it's very easy for us to get into a place where we're not approaching it from a way, like we kind of have this idea of what medicine is and what our relationship to hospitals are. And I really wanted to start breaking that down, because for somebody who lives with chronic illness, we often don't see hospitals as a place to gain a solution. It's much more of a place where we sometimes feel like we get more questions than answers. And so I tend to shy away from using medicine as almost like a prop in images. But I did want to show this image because I think the support between my family is something that's really powerful, and something that I wanted to share with others, because I know I'm personally grateful for the amount of support that my family has given me. And I think that their care for each other resonates so much in these images. I also, through this work, as I mentioned before, I really wanted to paint a portrait of each of my family members. And I wanted to include images that gave a three-dimensionality to the entire project. I made this work while I was an undergraduate, scenario, I was doing it as my thesis project. So I had professor input and external input. And one of the feedback notes that I would repeatedly get is, well, your images seem so dark. And when I look at this body of work, I don't see the darkness that others see. But I think that that points to a very interesting note about how others perceive uncomfortable subjects. And I think that it was very important for me in this work to start approaching that level of uncomfortableness so that conversations could be had, and our perspective could be shared. And then this was the first self-portrait that I had taken since about the age of 15 or 16. For some reason in college, I just was not drawn to making self-portraits. And this image and the image I'll show next came after my first surgery for endometriosis. And it was a point in my life where I felt so terribly misunderstood and very lost. I had been through a lot of misguided medical treatment and didn't really feel like I had a support system on the medical side of things. So I was starting to explore ways of how do I resolve this conflict within myself. And I started focusing on just little details of things that just stood out to me. Like, for example, um, they never removed the EKG leads off of my back. And to me, that just, it felt weird. And I wanted to explore that weirdness within myself. And that's when I really started realizing that I could use self-portraiture as a way to take a look at myself as if I was taking a portrait of somebody else and having a conversation with that person. But the person I'm having a conversation with is myself. In this image, I made this image, and it's the first in the series called Where the Red Flowers Bloom that I shot over the course of 2019. And it's specifically about my journey of diagnosis with endometriosis. And I shot this image right after I had learned that my first surgery was completely unsuccessful and I would have to be scheduled for another one. And in this image, I saw it once I took it, and I just felt like there was something there. And you can see the discoloration of skin on my back, you can see my ribs, and I just felt like there was something there that I needed to kind of push. But even at this point, I wasn't really making a lot of images at this point because I didn't know where to go with them or what to do with them. And at the same time that I started kind of tiptoeing into the self-portraiture realm again, I picked up the camera again where I kind of left off with A Family of Complicated Bodies. And I started documenting just really intense moments of emotion within my own family. And I realized that to me, the camera was becoming such a tool of um, capturing things that I just emotionally couldn't handle at that moment, or some things that had so much emotion for me that for some reason I was just compelled to make these images. And so this is an image of our 17-year-old cat passed away about a week before my second surgery. And just the timing of that and the heaviness of everything, I saw in my family, my own grief about my losing my own health. And I just feel like a lot of my family portraits started to become self-portraits again. This portrait also really feels like a turning point for me because it was one of the first portraits where I really, other than the first one that I showed, that I really focused on my face and what emotion that I was feeling. And this portrait, I think it was the turning point for me in both how I approach self-portraiture in a very artistic sense, but also how I approached it very emotionally, because I look at this image and I'm reminded of how much heaviness I was feeling in that moment, But I look at it through a lens of almost like this is somebody else. Like I've created an emotional artifact, and now I can leave that emotion there, almost like journaling or something like that. And so this image was right after my second surgery, and I found out that I would have to have a third surgery. So I was in a very heavy place. And I remember taking this image and I debated sharing it because it was my first time really showing my full body. I'm not particularly generically attractive in the image, but I shared it anyway. And I put it with some text, just kind of sharing how I felt. And that's how I realized to kind of add on to how self-portraiture became this emotional healing journey for me. I realized that photography is such a tool of connection, and the connection that I had been feeling that I was missing, I could find it through the thing that I love and I do every day. And I also, when I started shooting my family, to kind of back up a little bit, I've lived away from my family during college. And then for the year after, I continued to live away from my family. And then once became ill, I moved back in with my family. And I started to notice that that really impacted my perspective within my family photos, because I was no longer looking as a stranger from the outside. Not that I was a stranger to my family, but more because I hadn't been living with them. I wasn't with their routines. But as I began living in my family again, my perspective completely changed. And it was so interesting to see that within the images that I was interested in making, and then the ones that I was beginning to produce just because I was living there. And then this next couple of images actually do relate into a body of work that I called Inpatient, and it goes through two separate hospitalizations that I had within a 10-day period. So I was in the hospital for a life-threatening infection one week, and then I had a hysterectomy the next week. So it was kind of this really intense 2 weeks that I I just happened to have a camera with me both of those times. And I think what's really interesting to me, and maybe these images aren't even as compelling as some of my other work, but they're almost more interesting to me because I don't remember making a lot of them, which sounds pretty bad. But between being on medication and just the hectic, not really knowing what was going on, and the one hospitalization, I was visiting a friend, and the other hospitalization was after surgery. But these images, to me, they point to the things that I was interested in when I was at my least, I don't want to say focused, but I was least aware of my image making process. For some reason, I felt like I had to make these images, and they're just so interesting to me looking back at them, because um, they show exactly what I was interested in at the time. I shared the image of my mom, and then I kind of think it's funny that I made one with my dad, almost like a equal representation of my parents. And it's funny because it's completely different hospitals in two different parts of the state. But these two were also where I started thinking about, well, how can I incorporate my self-portraiture with my family? That's kind of the next step that I was looking at, right? Because I started off with my family, then I went to myself, and now how do I bring these two images together, or these two ideas? I'm also really interested in how photography still fails to capture some things sometimes, particularly in the case of the inner versus the outer, or the unseen and the seen. You can allude to things that have happened, but you don't know the full extent. Like from this image, um, laparoscopy scars are notorious because when you look at them, they're very unassuming. Like you would almost think that, oh, this was a very mild procedure, when in fact it was very involved and took a very long time to heal from. And I'm interested in that kind of barrier, that area where photography still can't quite get at certain things. And I'm interested in, well, how do I convey a little bit more? And again, returning to the family, I saw another shift after these two hospitalization experiences of how I was viewing my family, because at that point I had been living with my family for about 7 or 8 months. I was really in that culture, and my brother had moved out. So it was interesting having him visit and then having that perspective change as well. This is starting to get into the COVID time. Um, so we had very busy March in my household. My dad was hospitalized, and then I was hospitalized a week later, and I was hospitalized on the weekend that COVID started. So I got to really experience that anxiety of the hospital staff firsthand. And that was before we didn't even have any cases in my county, but the first case had happened in Florida. And feeling that anxiety on top of my own anxiety of being in the hospital, it was a very intense experience. And it started to really stick with me as far as thinking about the intensity of COVID. And so as I started thinking about COVID, as I mentioned before, I was still kind of, my head was filled with all of these things that I had experienced before COVID, and then mixing in COVID on top of that. How do I start exploring that, and distinguishing what I was thinking about from one event to the other, or does it matter that I distinguished that? Social media has been one of my primary sources of socialization for the past year, just for the sheer inability to go out and socialize, or I haven't worked since November. So I was started really thinking about how my world was kind of beginning to intersect with the outside world as more and more people started relying on social media to um, interact with each other and form these connections that I had kind of already been immersed in. Well, how do I use social media as a primary socialization outlet? And then to kind of muddy the waters even more, I started producing the work for Vessel, which is the book that I'm publishing through Fifth Wheel Press in September. And this body of work deals directly with my experience of having gone through a hysterectomy, and being young and being female bodied, and my experience of having femaleness be a barrier to medical treatment. And I noticed in this work that I began to work so performatively, that it was completely different to most of the other work that I had even begun to make. And it was almost a welcome distraction to make this work during the time of the pandemic, because it let me work on one small thing rather than trying to digest everything at once. And to go back to what I was saying about social media and the way that I kind of saw the world as slowing down to the pace that I've been living in for a little bit, I began realizing a lot of the conversations that I started to have with myself were being echoed around me. And I think that's really neat that we're starting to have conversations about food scarcity and food availability. And in my case, this image is about my extensive list of allergies. But I feel like there's such a conversation to be had about food access in this time of the pandemic and how different communities are, accessing food, or how disabled people or people with diet restrictions may or may not be able to fulfill those dietary requirements. I keep going back to this idea of the haircut because I think it's so interesting how that's become a controversial statement in our society now, where people are protesting about haircuts. And I've always been really interested in routines, and being immune suppressed, I know that I'm um, not going to be going out for a while because I'm not comfortable doing so. And so I've had to learn a few ways of managing my hair and just small things like that. But I think it's interesting, these routines that we're creating during this time. And then I started to shoot again. Kind of, I'm not really in a project at the moment, but just thinking about the continuation of chronic illness and what that means. Because as Susan was mentioning in the introduction, a lot of times we kind of want an ending to things, right? And that's very human and very natural, because we want suffering to come to an end, but we don't realize that there's a long road to get there, if there's even an ending. So I really am starting to see my work as turning from reacting to hospitalizations and intense bouts of illness to more the lived in moments of every day that I'm learning how to manage and deal and move on. And then to end, kind of going back to this idea of external and internal, I made this image with my mom because we both live with chronic illness, and we happen to share a rheumatologist, and she was going to the rheumatologist one day and I was driving her, and we realized that our um, our entire experience of going to the doctors has become such a more labor intensive process, which is, it already is in some ways a labor intensive process. Um, but now there's also the added level of anxiety because of living immune compromised and having that vulnerability, that we've been having conversations like, well, do we push out that doctor's appointment a little bit longer? Like, what about if we just wait a couple more weeks and see what the numbers are like? Where we're starting to question our own care because of the larger issues that are happening. And I think thinking about not just how this is affecting us, but there are many other communities and people that are struggling with these same kind of questions of, well, what do we do being vulnerable in this era, and how do we cope with that? And so I wanted to make this image just to kind of remind both of us that we're supporting each other and we're working with each other.
Frances, is this a good time for questions?
Yeah, yeah.
Good. So if anyone has questions, feel free to type them into the chat window. If you're not sure how to access that, you can roll your cursor down to the bottom of the screen. And here we go. Sunny Strader wants to know, how has self-portraiture affected your self-confidence?
It's definitely improved it. I guess I didn't touch on this too much, but a lot of my healing process and a lot of the things that I was working with personally were very much self-worthiness wounds and things like that, where um, in, the experience of being ill is one of those things that it can be very damaging to your self-confidence because you're losing not only physical ability, but um, I don't know what body I'm waking up with some days or how that body might even look. So it can be difficult. But I've learned a lot of compassion towards myself through these image making processes, of how to just lend myself a little bit more empathy, because I'm making these images as if I was making them of a friend, and I should be a friend to myself. We should all be friends to ourselves.
You, Frances, you had talked about, and maybe I didn't hear it right, but you were talking about creating these portraits where they felt like they were another person, and then you were able to dialogue with the image. But then you also talked about just leaving the image there. I wonder if you'd share a little bit more about that inner process of how you re-engage your own images after the making of them, and what that's meant for you.
So to answer that, I guess I could go a little bit into the process of how I actually make these images. So I'll usually, especially some of the more emotionally intensive pieces, I'd make them and they'd kind of sit on my camera for a little bit, maybe a week or two. With film images, I'm only processing them a couple times a year. So it gives me that emotional distance in between them. Um, so that I'm able to kind of look back at them. But it also comes to bring the inner work side of it into this discussion. It comes a lot from looking at these images and journaling about them. Honestly, I write a lot about my images, just even if nobody is going to see what I write, I am constantly just examining, what am I shooting? Why am I shooting it? How could I express what I'm feeling a little bit more? What is being expressed in this image? And so I'm constantly writing, and I think that's been so important in understanding why I'm making this work and how to communicate that.
Marie left a beautiful message just thanking you for your brilliance, grace, and courage in sharing your story both through images and words. And she was interested in hearing about how your creation of images allowed you to distance yourself from the emotional artifact, and how does it compare to journaling, which you just spoke to a little bit. Yeah, yeah. Um, I would be, anybody else have questions? I don't want to keep jumping in if folks are sitting on other questions.
I do. I'm just typing it out. It's a bit lengthy.
You're welcome to speak it if you would prefer.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right then. So Frances, hi. It's Alexis. My
Hi,
question for
Alexis.
you. My question for you tied two of the things you talked about together. You had made a comment about how some of your professors or external people who commented on your work said it was dark. Um, as you know, my thesis was also something that came from a very vulnerable place, and I received that comment as well from a few people. And I was just curious about your thoughts on, do you think letting go of some of the more uncomfortable aspects or some of the confrontation of the topic you're talking about would um, is sacrificing it worth reaching more people, or is it more important to continue to address your work and your own vulnerability in the way that's best for you, especially if it's already touching people and creating conversation? That was a lot. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. Thanks. Yeah, so I think this can be a tough one because, well, I'm like my instinct is to, of course, come back and say do what feels intuitively best for you. Um, I think hearing and understanding why people might not want to see the darkness in a topic, uh, like understanding where they're coming from, and if it's a place of, oh, this isn't at, like, is it a thing of this isn't adding value, or is it coming from a place of they're too uncomfortable to want to have those conversations, and kind of understanding the difference, because I feel this with my own work. Sometimes I wonder, like, Vessel was very much an experience of wrestling with this question for me, because it's about, I gave up being a mom, and because I had health issues, but I pursued a hysterectomy, and I gave up any shot at fertility. And um, I didn't want that work to be doom and gloom or make anybody else feel bad about the choices that they made about their own body, but I also needed it to be an artifact of my own personal experience. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question correctly, but I think that this is something that it's one of those things you've got to kind of write about and write about and write about, and like feel so strongly within yourself. Well, why are you adding this aspect or another aspect? And it has to kind of come from within yourself instead of somebody else's dictation. And if anybody else has thoughts on that too.
That was great. Thank you. Just being mindful and being aware of where they're coming from with that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Thank you.
And Frances, the only thing I would sort of add to that is, there are different ways to value work, and different reasons for work to be shared, and that I think one of the ways that work that we don't talk enough about is the role of just bearing witness. And I think in some ways that is part of what makes it really hard for people to stay present to what's uncomfortable, because we do have this very curative, fixing culture. And that when we see images that are uncomfortable or experience discomfort, just the role of trying to bear witness, I think we don't have a lot of practice in it. It's one of the beautiful things that I think photography brings to the world, is we can even in some ways titrate in difficult topics by asking people to bear witness to things they can't fix. Photographs aren't going to change. You're standing in a museum or a gallery or looking at a slideshow or hearing someone speak, and the image sits there before you. There's nothing you can really do with it or about it. And I feel like that professor's role was that he just couldn't bear witness. And so I think that's one of the great gifts that images and image making brings. Morgan is asking, do you feel like the reactions to your work are heavily influenced by gender? Like if a guy did similar work, would people approach it really differently?
Yes, for a few different reasons. Because I think I get couple different camps of reaction to my images. Sometimes I get the reaction of, "Wow, you're such a strong woman," and I appreciate that. But then the conversation kind of ends there, and I think it might be same for a man to kind of honor the strength in the images. But I also get questioned a lot on, um, or rather told how I should approach my own health. And I think that that's a very female centric issue, unfortunately. But I also think, in the flip side of that, if a man was making these images, I think there would be conversations about the emotional, um, I'm not sure what I'm trying to say, but like like I think the emotion of them, I think that would also be called into question if a man were to make these images, where then it would shift into a conversation about masculinity, more so than a female centric issue.
Just circling back real quick, Marie was also asking, describe any differences, if they exist, in expressing your emotions through images and then through words.
I think so. Especially when I journal, I write. So I'm doing something very physical. And I think I'm a big believer in, sorry, in like the physical, it releases, right? Sorry, one of the lovely things of chronic illness. um, but yeah, so doing something very physical, like it releases emotion, right? And it might not be in the same way. I mean, the act of making photographs is physical, but there's something really cathartic about just scribbling on a page and, you know, getting something out. And I find that I'm starting to notice within myself as I move more figuratively with my photography, I'm becoming more literal in my writing, where I'm writing a lot more nonfiction pieces, like exploring the sensations of my day through the writing, where I'm exploring the metaphor through photography.
Jonathan Johnson wants to know, what is your relationship with experimentation when it comes to making images, and how much is spontaneity allowed in?
Yeah, so when I make self-portraits, I don't use a hand trigger device or anything. It's all I put the timer on for 10 seconds and then I go to my position, and that's how I allow a little bit of spontaneity into that aspect of it, because I don't know exactly, I know around when the shutter is going to go off, but I don't know exactly when the shutter is going to go off. And so that gives me just like a little bit of randomness within the images. And then I produce a lot more work than I show, and I use a variety of processes. So I'll jump around between film and digital, just experimenting with how things feel and how things make me feel. Like if I'm responding to a work because the act of shooting it and then putting it in a drawer for a couple of months and then sending it off to my lab, and that produces a very different emotional feeling in me than if I were to click the shutter digitally. Like some of the hospital images that I shared, I shot those with film and I didn't really have good settings or anything. And some of those images, they convey exactly what I was feeling at the time. And I think that that level of experimentation, just kind of searching for the feeling and the essence of an experience, is what I'm really interested in. So I think obviously there's a little bit more staging in some of these images than others, but yeah, I try to allow for some spontaneity and experimentation.
Mike Bellamy has a two-part question, so remind me to make sure to ask the second part. In sharing this work, have you found any particular venues, physical settings, or other means of sharing that are either especially conducive or not to creating the conversations you want to create and the emotional impact that you hope to achieve?
It's very interesting, but I've had a radically different experience of social media than a lot of people who talk about health on social media have, in which I've experienced this absolutely amazing community of people that have, you know, kind of rallied around my work, and I'm so appreciative of that. Not to say that I personally feel like my images exist really well as books and things that can be kind of sat with for a while and physically felt. I am definitely an artist that loves seeing things very physical and like touch and feel a photo book. Um, but I will say that I have had, I would say the least successful experience that I had with this particular type of work was my thesis exhibition, in all honesty. I just felt like it wasn't personal enough, and you're seeing a whole bunch of work, and it just wasn't the kind of intimacy that I wanted to people to have, that kind of exchange of being able to sit with an idea.
And he's also asked, are there ways that you'll not share the work because you feel that it doesn't work or maybe received in ways that don't align with your intentions?
I'm not sure, because I haven't really shown this work that much outside of social media, and then having self-published a few small runs of things. So I'm not sure if there's something. I'm not really sure if I have an answer to that question.
It's a great question, because I think it intersects at that thing of public and private, and this idea of compassion towards self, and holding something tenderly, right? And so I think there's a question about, I think it's a fascinating question to ponder. Anna says that, Frances, your work is extremely emotional and powerful. I'm curious if creating such vulnerable work and starting these conversations has opened other people up in various ways that you might not have anticipated. And has the pandemic had any influence in how people understand or respond to the work?
Yeah, I've definitely noticed. I've had friends come to me asking for me to elaborate on an experience that I've had, because they've seen the images and there's been something that they've experienced that they just aren't sure what to do with it. And so I've had people reach out and say, look, your images have led me to have these conversations that have like bettered themselves. And that is such a humbling experience to have somebody say that, that because I'm open, they can feel like they've been open. And I think the pandemic has, in the sense that I'm not sure actually, because um, as I mentioned kind of earlier, the line between pandemic and not pandemic is very blurry for me, because I don't have a lot of the same separators that other people had. Um, I work from home or stay at home and these sorts of things. And I think the pandemic has had me step away from the social media a little bit more too, to just kind of focus on myself. Um, I think people do resonate a little bit more, like when I post something about a mask or being immunocompromised. I think people respond differently in that way. But I haven't noticed a huge shift.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else has some questions? I, of course, have 1,000. But, anybody else want to throw something out? While we're waiting to see if anybody else, you talked about, you had sort of said this thing that there are areas where photography can't reach. Where are some places in your life you think that, have you encountered that photography just in a way can't touch it?
I think so. A lot of my work is about mostly invisible diseases, and that's one area that I have conversations with people about. I'm struggling. How do I pull out like the sensations of having invisible disease when there's really no sign? I mean, I can post images of my scars, but nobody will know the pain that I feel alongside of them. And how I constantly am going back and forth with, how do I get the sensations to really come across in photography?
Mm-hmm.
And do I start working more with metaphor then, and stray more away from this kind of documentary sense, or how do I start to approach that? So for me, it's definitely physical sensations. How do I get those onto a photograph?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to throw out some questions? Could you say a little bit more about, you know, that this sort of intersection of the inner work and the outer work that arises through practicing photography. And I mean, I think photography is such a transformative medium, and I'm always just so curious how other people are using it in that kind of inner work or inner transformative way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I know there's a lot of emotional baggage that comes with illness and trauma and things like that. So for me, being able to recognize visually some of these things that I'm dealing with and visually see them, be confronted with them, that has helped me kind of create a response within myself. So with the journaling practice and with the photographing, I've really been able to work on how I react. So where I might have reacted emotionally to something before, now I'm grabbing a camera, and that switch of
Mm.
what I'm doing in that moment has helped me, because then I, I don't get so emotionally upset. I get more like, okay, well, I've got this thing I'm feeling. How do I express it? Where do I go with this?
Mm-hmm.
And if it's something I've said a million times, then how do I say it in a completely different way, or in just a slightly different way?
Mm-hmm. Would you like to say a little more about your book? I'd love to hear about it and the press that you chose, and when it's coming out, which I can't wait.
Yeah, I'll share my screen and go through those images again. Um, so I was um, approached by Fifth Wheel Press back in February about being one of their initial artists. They're very new press, and their first releases are actually coming out in July. And so I was approached about being one of their first artists, and the founder, Nat, she loves my work, and we've talked, and we have very similar interests as far as this kind of inner work and photography. So I wanted to create a set of images that really explored my emotional state regarding having gone through a hysterectomy at the age of 23, which is a very kind of unique experience. And I also wanted to create something that other people in my situation could look at and reference, even if they didn't see themselves in it. I felt so alone, not so much because I had to go through the surgery, but because I didn't know of anybody else in my age group that had kind of gone through this procedure. What was I going to expect? What was I going to feel like afterwards? And I mean, I could read accounts by other women, but I didn't know how I was going to feel. And I also was sorting through having had 7 previous years of doctors telling me that a hysterectomy would be the absolute worst thing for me, that I would immediately become depressed, that it would cause all of these other things. And it never was about any of the things that I was actually going to experience physically. It usually came down to the question of fertility. And as somebody who doesn't really subscribe to being overly feminine, or I never was really pulled towards motherhood, I didn't know how to separate their voices from what I actually wanted. And so after the fact, I started making these images to explore, well, what was I feeling, and to process that amount of frustration at having been put through 7 years of nobody really running the correct tests, nobody really searching for anything, because everybody kind of just expected me to have a kid early on and then feel better. So I wanted to approach this in a way that it wasn't just about anger, but it was also about the act of letting go of all of that and going back to this idea of healing. Like, this book became so much about a letting go and exploring who I am now after this surgery, after letting go of all of these other preconceived notions of who I should be. And I just wanted to create something that was at the same time me learning who I am, but also an artifact of this experience that I went through. I also, during this particular project, I started thinking too about heritage, and there's fertility issues in my family, and especially through my mother's side. And so I started connecting with these ideas of not only heritage, but um, like inheriting things, inherited diseases. And I was giving myself permission through using these sort of metaphors to kind of cleanse myself and be reborn into somebody that wasn't burdened by all of these past experiences and traumas.
I'm remembering somebody had asked a question. I think it was Anna actually asked it about the various ways that you have impacted people that maybe weren't as anticipated. And I can definitely speak to one way that I've witnessed, which is we run practice groups through 6 Feet Photography Project, and Frances facilitated a practice group on self-portraiture, and I've gotten to interact with those students later. And I think you've pointed towards this, but I think it's worth repeating, which is that when we make courageous work, there's a way that we give other people permission to also be courageous. And inner work, when we touch into really dark and difficult and hard to hold emotions, isn't a party. I mean, it's hard work. And creating a pathway that people know that you can engage with hard work and ask deep questions and move into those places, and that you come out the other side not so much fixed but transformed, in the sense that it's a meaning making process. I think it has been just really remarkable the way that your process grants other people permission to do similarly important work in their life. And so I'm really grateful for your contribution to our community in that way. And I've seen the work that was produced during that self-portraiture practice group, and there's equally rich and meaningful work that emerged from that place. And so yeah, I celebrate you as a teacher as well. It's been
Thank you.
very, very impactful. Yeah.
Well, they inspired me too, because this talking about being vulnerable, this it's hard, like you said, it's very difficult. And I would give them journal prompts every single week, and asking pretty tough questions. Like I honestly, I going in, I didn't know if anybody would respond to that, or if that would be anything that they would even want. And the amount of honesty that has come from that group, like it inspired me to then continue my work and everything. And so I'm grateful for that experience. They had just as much of an effect on me, I think.
And folks, also, you are welcome to unmute yourself if you have questions. I know sometimes it can be hard to formulate a question typing it out. It might just be easier to ask it in conversation or in dialogue. So I believe you have permission to unmute yourself. If you can't, type something in the chat window to me, and I'll make sure to give you permission to do that.
Wait, I'm going to ask a question. Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, because I was wanting to put an image that I took of my husband who had corona and was in hospital, and I was kind of too scared to do that, but now I feel I can do it thanks to you showing me what you've done. Because this is a photograph of him where his chest was hurting, and they were asking where it was hurting, and they were putting these red crosses everywhere where his chest was hurting. And I photographed it, and I was like, I can't put that out, but I feel now I can. So thank you so much, Frances.
Oh, thank you.
That's okay. Yeah, he was in hospital for 8 days,
Oh,
but
wow.
thank God he's completely recovered.
Oh, I'm so
And,
happy to hear that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. And
Yeah.
so here I was with this image that I was like, ooh, I don't know if I can, anybody wants to see what I've photographed, but I'm happy now. I'm going to put it out. So thank you.
Thank you, Leslie.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Okay.
Anybody else have questions or comments are also very welcome.
I gotta say something. So one thing that really stood out to me that you said was work on one small thing instead of digesting everything at once. And that is an incredibly difficult thing to do in a time of age like now where all this information is coming at you all at once. And it can be completely overwhelming between the politics, the coronavirus, and everything that's going on with internal demons and so on. And you found something that has kind of made you like forget all about that and instead live in the present moment and focus on what's in front of you. And I think that in itself is rather courageous to do. It's very difficult to really just sit down and accomplish something within yourself at that moment. Yeah.
Thanks, John. John's one of my best friends, for everybody to know. Just he's fantastic artist too. Yeah, well, I think kind of touching on that, we're talking a lot about societal change, and we need to have these kinds of conversations, right? We need to have the courage to get uncomfortable and get in and understand and listen. And I think that's what I try to do in my work is create a conversation point where people can listen and contribute and just see things a little bit differently too.
Yeah. And as you said, it's also a conversation with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about it. I think John's y'all are connecting a dot, which is this idea of certainly a bearing witness to the self, but that photography is this amazing process of presencing to ourselves as well, right? Of showing up to the moments of our own life. And it's such a powerful way to me, I always think of attention and love as being very similar. We bring attention to the things that we love, and there's an act in self-portraiture about bringing attention to the self that is an act of love, and bringing attention to our family, or so
Melanie, oh, there we go. Yeah, so regarding, she asked, were your family members aware of the camera being there? Yeah, so before I even started photographing, we sat down and we had a conversation about what they wanted from the project, and then what my kind of goals were from the project. And I feel so fortunate that we're very like-minded in my family, and we have very close-knit ideas and everything. So my dad works in healthcare, so he kind of sees firsthand how some of these conversations about chronic illness and about day-to-day impact of how a disease or a treatment plan affects the patient's life. And so these were the conversations that really we had together that started to make the work even possible. Because I don't think that without their participation, without them wanting to show these things, that the work would be much of anything. I think that it would have a much different tonality than if I was kind of just making these images without them being aware of why I was making the images, or when I was making the images. They really like, I remember when we got to see the images as an exhibition, and they really enjoyed that because these images, they're our lives, right? And I think it's very easy, like going back to this idea of, having people say, "Oh, this project is really dark." For us, it's a record of our lives, and even when we see images of like our pets as they're passing and things like that, it's memories of tough moments, but they're tough moments that we got to through together. And so that network of support is kind of very central to all of us and how we respond to the images.
Anyone else want to jump in? I was going to ask, I think we had some, where was it? Yeah, I think you touched on that, this role of photography in expanding people's capacity for discomfort. And when we think about cultural change within sort of the new trauma paradigm, there is this thing that sometimes, like, if we overwhelm somebody's nervous system, then since they're not hardly taking in any information at all, and sort of knowing right dosing, right distance, right, for how we share the images, but also with our own creative process of knowing what's enough. And were there moments with that personal private edge that there were images you started to make and decided not to? Have there been moments where you're just like, this goes too far, or this is too private, or are there things you don't talk about or don't share? I mean, you don't have to say what they are, of course, because then you'd be sharing, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, so, well, there's one instance. I did make an image for the family project. It's the only image that I actually took out, um, because in my family we're very intuitive with how, like, boundary lines, and something about the expression that my dad had, and like I showed the image to him, and he didn't even think anything of it. But there was something in the expression of that image that I just felt like I had crossed the line, and I just removed it because it wasn't, to me, it wasn't worth me having that image and thinking, well, is my dad just being nice, or is it, is it
Right.
actually too far? And then as far as with myself, the vessel project was definitely one that I went back and forth because I admit to having a lot of anger around that entire process of how everything happened. So I was trying not to make angry images. And so there were some images that I made that I just cut them because it got way too much into the being angry rather than trying to approach the whatever I was feeling, which, I mean, was anger, but there was something else added to that. And then as far as stuff that I don't talk about, because a lot of times writing does go with my images, I don't talk too much about my personal protocol with chronic illness, because I feel like I would never want my images to somebody to take an image of mine and go to their chronically ill friend and say, so and so does this, why don't you try this? Because I think that would be so damaging. Because I've had similar experiences where it's just the best of intentions, but it comes off as, well, why didn't you try this, instead of a helpful thing. And so I try to steer very much away from the actual action steps in my treatment plan, because it's not, I think that the conversation doesn't need that, and that it can exist without that.
We have a question from Cecil, but I was going to type to him, but I didn't get there fast enough to ask if he wanted to ask it personally. think it could be an interesting dialogue around this topic. Cecil, would you like to unmute yourself and ask, or do you want me to ask it?
Sure, Susan.
There he is.
Well, I was wondering how, like you talk about self-healing with your images, but I was wondering how does the images, if they help or not to heal like the whole family? Is it something about yourself, or is it something with other people too?
I mean, I don't want to speak on the behalf of my family, but I think we've definitely, it's helped to foster understanding between all of us, because it can be very difficult when you're in a family dynamic and each person is dealing with something different, and we all have different triggers and we all have different, you know, one of us might feel amazing one day while somebody else feels really poorly, and it's how do we navigate that as a family unit so that we're not overly stepping on somebody else. And so I think that these images have served as a reminder for us that we all are dealing with things, but we can deal with them together rather than apart. So I think as far as healing, it's been a reminder of the support system that we have.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see. Melanie's asking, hey, Melanie, did you want to jump on, or do you want me to ask? Give her a second. Anyway, maybe not. So she wanted to know, do you find that because people use social media to reveal all aspects of their lives, that it helped you to feel comfortable sharing your images?
Yes and no. I was initially very terrified to share the images that I had made, almost because I wasn't sure if it fit into the social media narrative that is already there. But in some ways, I saw another photographer, Georgie Williman, who works with endometriosis, and she also works with men's mental health. And so I saw her images on Instagram, and they helped me kind of realize, well, maybe there is a space for this conversation. I think, in all honesty, it's almost seeing other people share every aspect of their life has almost made my job a little bit more difficult, of knowing when it's okay to have private images where I just have them for myself. And it's a boundary that I have to constantly set with myself and kind of think about, because everybody's sharing everything. Is it okay for me to not share, like, if I'm having a particularly bad day? Do I have to share an image of that, or can I just keep that moment for myself and not expose myself on a day that I don't feel like having that conversation?
Yeah, I love that as another way of thinking about the public-private, that we do have this, you know, if a photo didn't land on Instagram, did it really happen? kind of way that we approach, where, and in that way, photographs become a substitution for the experience instead of a way to create more meaning or a deeper relationship to the experience.
Yeah, and I find that too, when if I'm having a stretch of good health and I'm not making these images where it's addressing the poorer aspects of my health, I almost have to question with myself, like, when do I share these images? And like, I almost feel like a conflict about, well, I'm not making any images right now, or I'm not making the same kinds of images because they're not necessary for me in that moment. But because of the pace of social media, there is a pressure there to constantly be productive and constantly be putting out content.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like artists are in such a strange time where we're supposed to be introspective and creative and innovative, but also marketing our work and branding ourselves. And yeah, it's an interesting time. Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to throw out a question? Marie says, Marie, did you want to jump on? We can, sometimes when there's less of us towards the end, we can, is Marie? Maybe not. I think there's like a delay, and then by the time somebody's like, yes, I'm already talking.
Okay, sure, Frances, yes.
There she is.
I just wanted to express my gratitude for your everything about what you've said and shared, and your candor and generosity have been appreciated. And when you mentioned, when you struggle between, do I not share the image or do I share it? It seemed like another aspect of a generous dimension of the artist in you. It's almost like, well, this is private. Like, do I need to put it out there, and how might it help someone? And I don't remember your exact words, but when you talked about some poor medical decisions, I forget the exact phrase that you used, but I was like, whoa, how kind is that in that description? I was struck by that, and just thank you for everything that you've shared. Your work is just beyond language. It's really profound.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Anna, did you want to jump on?
Hi. Sorry, this is more just a comment, but I just wanted to say that you have such a sensitivity to boundaries and empathy, and it really comes across in your work. And I think hearing how you speak about it, and how you collaborate with your family in that way, it's just really admirable. And I think in photography, it's such a important thing to consider, and I just really appreciate that you're making this work, and the way you speak about it. I think that sort of intention can spread, and just a compliment.
Thank you.
Yeah, Anna, and I like that you mentioned too that it can sometimes be lost. And one of the things we talk about and think about is that, photography has its own history of violence in even the language that we use to talk about. We take photographs, we shoot. It's an extractive medium that hasn't always had a good history of being sensitive and relational and connected. And I think we're starting to have those conversations about what is the nature of consent, what access do photographers have, and that I think these are such important conversations. And photographers who lead in the world with images and stories about photographing from a place, a deep relational place, I think it is starting to change the culture of image making, and I am super stoked about that. So, yeah. Great. Anyone else want to ask some questions or make comments? Frances, was there anything else you wanted to say or share that might still be floating around for you?
Something will probably come to me as soon as we leave.
always the way it works. Always the way it is.
It's funny because I find, kind of going back to the journaling thing, writing is also, it's my most reliable form of communication as somebody who struggles with brain fog. So sometimes I'm looking through my notes right now, and I'm finding that even my writing has kind of failed me there. But kind of going back to what Marie was saying about the medical missteps, part of the reason why I'm so vocal about that is because we have a medical system where in some certain diseases, the patients become almost their own advocates because there's not a lot of education around them. And I know that I suffered from just going through doctors that had information that was 20 years old and making decisions based off of 20-year-old information. And I really wouldn't want somebody else to go through that experience. If I have the information and I can pass it on, that's something that I would love to do through my work, is to kind of update the medical, like the understanding of certain diseases, and maybe save somebody half of the headache that I've gone through or something.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you also speak to, and it was around Morgan's question, which was, you know, it's a longer conversation and a bigger conversation about the current evidence around the disparity in treatment between men and women, and especially anything to do with reproductive health or very women-specific illnesses. But also, you know, I have really close friends who struggle with mental health issues, and some are men and some are women, and the women are treated in this very patronizing, belittling, really like children. And then if the man comes with the same mental health issue, there's this kind of idea that, you know, everything was supposed to be perfect and right and stable and clear for them, and they're going to do everything they can, in a sense, to get them back on the field. And neither one really addresses, you know, the heart of it, but that there's just these radically different ways that that health is approached. And one of the documentary projects I'm working on right now around the opioid crisis is that the evidence is out right now that all of the research around those drugs was conducted on men, not women. Women have a 3 times higher addiction rate to opioids than men do because they react in their system radically different. So we have this, you know, so we could have over and over again talk about the ways in which gender and the female body has, you know, the impact that has in terms of how we're trying to engage with the medical community. And I appreciate the intersection of how what is most personal and private can also be what's most universal and political, without trying to be political. And in some ways, I think the work is more successful when it comes at the storytelling from the most authentic and personal level. And so I appreciate that. And it's sometimes the harder place to begin. So, yeah. So I want to remind everyone, of course, that we'll be back here next Thursday. We're here every Thursday. We'll be our own core 6 Feet member, Mike Bellamy. I'm really looking forward. It's a body of work that called At Home with Death that is one of the most tender and beautiful approaches. He was in relationship to a woman and her family through the entire process, and has continued to be with that family after her death. And it is one of those shining examples of how photography can be this tool for deep relationship building, and how the photographs themselves can impact and change cultural understandings about how we approach death and dying, but also how we come to support and nourish each other through community support, and part of that, of course, through image making. And so we'll be back here at 7 o'clock next week. And Mike Bellamy, speaking of him, is relaunching that postponed talk with Annie Tritt and Secret Agent 23 Skidoo, which is going to be a fantastic conversation. He hosts a Tuesday night event called Between Us that he moderates a beautiful conversation between artists of different mediums and different crafts, and how those mediums impact and influence one another. So that'll be meeting a little bit earlier than usual. So that's Tuesday, July 7th at 5:30. And as always, keep an eye out for this week at 6 Feet coming into your box. If you didn't sign up through our website and just got sent. Some people we directly send Zoom links to. Please do visit the website and sign up for the newsletter so that we can make sure that you receive that this week at 6 feet. And Anna's here. She has very graciously offered to host a practice group on nostalgia. I'm so excited about this group. And so look for that also in this week's newsletter. And if you haven't yet had the opportunity to visit Frances's featured portfolio on our website, please do. Her words and writing are really touching, and there's even some images there that we didn't see tonight. And so that's a big treat. So unless people have other announcements that I forgot or other comments or questions they want to ask, we'll give it just a second to see. Good. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I know I say that and it sounds like a frivolous thing to say, but it really touches me and touches my heart. And without you here, there's really no happening. And so so grateful for your attention and your presence and your membership in this community. So I look forward to seeing everyone next week. Frances, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Great. Yeah. We usually hang out here, so we're done. We usually hang out here for a few minutes just in case anybody has questions, and we just sort of say goodbye and welcome to hop off as you're done.
Thank you again.
And your mom was here, and I was nervous. I was really wanting to put her on the spot and ask her questions, but I resisted because we forgot to ask her in advance. So, yeah. Great. Frances, that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Susan.